Lori, we're good.
Okay, it is 5:38 and I will call the meeting to order. Tasia, would you like to do roll call?
Sure. Marge Blue,
Here.
Katie Thermos, Lori Belargin,
Here.
Bruce Belargin,
Here.
Sheree Link,
Here.
Roxanne Kendall,
Here.
Patty Jo Forsberg.
District Commission, approval of agenda. Would somebody care to make a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda.
Thank you, Roxanne. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Sheree. Let's go to the school finance review then. Dave.
Hi. So, get the camera on the board. There we go. Thanks, Tasia. This is kind of a high-level introduction to school finance. I'll be talking about things that are kind of the basics, the bedrock, the important things that determine the revenue we have to spend and also where we spend it, how we keep track of it, how we review it. I wanted to jump in through the district website because I wanted to illustrate the accessibility for people. So first we'll do that. We'll go into the website, look a little bit, I'll explain a few things, and then we'll go through the presentation. I have updated a few of the charts with current year data that have longitudinal data for multiple districts to illustrate some points on the website. And we're in the process of kind of migrating a lot of what we do on the website to Google platform type things. And we've done that with the financial reports page. So some of this is still in process of being moved. Some of it, when we updated a couple of the charts, they're a little fuzzy. We'll fix that. That'll get taken care of. It may help for you to follow along on your own computer, just so you can hopefully see it a little clearer. And again, I'll give the context. It's not that you need to see specific, tiny numbers, but the trends are important. So, all that being said, from the district main page, district drop down, business services and operations department, takes you to our homepage for business services. And underneath, we have all sorts of links that are helpful for staff and families. On the right-hand side, we have some of the quick links to good information. There's the debt service. We can see this was a big component of our discussion when we talked about what would the levy look like with some debt service falling off when we passed the previous referendum. Well, it shouldn't be much of a change, and we can see that graphically. We can see the historical numbers and the future numbers, referendum results. It's informational. Risk management is similar. Commercial insurances, work comp, and our mod. Any of these things I'm happy to talk about, but I just wanted to give you the quick highlight that they exist here. I put out a newsletter. This used to be mailed out every fall, or I guess winter for the December newsletter. And it's levy heavy. It talks a lot about where did we end up as far as setting the levy, as far as the effect on municipalities, on homeowners, and in comparison to prior years. There's good charts with hopefully clear labeling on what's being illustrated. For instance, as state aid goes down, generally levy goes up. That's kind of the gist of this chart. But it does break all of this down by municipality, what the levy is, what the expectation is, how we got there. So I wanted to be sure to highlight the things that are out here, the resources for information that are out here. There's a discussion of what an assessment is, how that can affect individuals' property taxes, the Wisconsin Department of Revenue Guide for property owners, and so forth. So it's broken down. There's some levy information, business services and operations. All the reports, the major reports that we talk about and that I submit in one form or another come here. This is a site that's been migrated to a Google Home. A little different than before if you're familiar with this. Here is where you find the information from the codes, the breakdown. If you ever want a copy or need to see it again, for reference, I do include that on a monthly basis as well. And here are some of the bigger reports. The budget to actual reports on a quarterly basis. They're all linked in live. There's 3 of those per fiscal year. And each different type of report has a small description in the drop-down, what it is that this is showing. So we've got those, we've got the budget hearing packets, the annual report, which is actual data, what happened, what really was spent, what revenue was received, where did this all happen. That's filed every year with DPI. You can see here the timing, published after the annual financial audit is complete. The budget reports, which we just signed off on the amended budget report. So that report is in here for this current year. Again, all by year, live links. And then our financial statements as well. These are the audits that occur after the fiscal year, for that fiscal year. And I'll talk about audits a little bit more coming up. And additionally here, there's where do you find more information? And then there's a link, of course, to the monthly reports that are part of the board meetings. You can find always attached to the agendas. So we were in the financial reports, links right here. We're going to end up in the process presentation. Before we go there, I want to stop in quickly with a little bit more budget information, financial planning. So these are some of the charts that, like I said, they're a little fuzzy because I updated some current years and we haven't worked out the tweaks in the, making it as clear as possible, while also we're considering transferring all this to more of a Google base. But for the moment, let me mention, this is where the budget planning calendar lives, which we talk about at the budget hearing every year. And there's a more in-depth budget overview that's, again, also somewhat higher level, but it tells you kind of, there's a glossary of terms, there's all these things, these definitions, a little bit of history, how we got here, our current state budget, what is the goal of funding per the state legislature, where are we at, what are we achieving, and a little bit of also like specific information for Somerset, just high level, general fund, revenue expenditure, surplus deficit, fund balance. Again, a chart, expenditure and fund balance, how they have been correlated over the years. And that lives here, budgeting and financial planning. So to define a few terms, our revenues are determined in extreme part by the revenue limit. So this talks about how revenue limits work, the main factors being membership FTE, so student count turned into a full-time equivalent. And the purpose of this is to show some regional schools, some school districts close to us, so we can see trend over time for the geographical region. I tried to make sure Somerset was the kind of the thickest, brightest red line here, so hopefully that's clear. The years are on bottom. The 3-year average membership full-time equivalent count is on the left. So you can see we've kind of gone up and then down a little bit, 3-year average. I did exclude a couple of the bigger districts from the membership. There's 2 membership counts. I excluded the bigger districts just because they make it so you can't see the rest of the districts. It makes the graph compress on the bottom. But I do include them in these per member charts, maximum revenue per member. This is revenue limit, maximum revenue per member. And we all look very, very similar, except for a few special cases. Now, we all seem to go up and then down and then slowly back up. And this right here was Act 10, where revenues were decreased per member by 5.5%. And so everybody dropped. And then there wasn't a lot of increased revenue for a while, and now it's starting to increase again. Now, the two exceptions, you will see these lines where you're going, oh, following the group, whoa, jump way up. And then here's Somerset, we just jumped way up. And that is when districts pass an operational referendum. Then their revenue limit expands by that amount. And so the per member amount jumps up correspondingly. The one other way that you can get a line that does not match the others, this darkest blue line is Hudson. And how they are different is that they underlevy to an extreme degree. And so they have had, over time, the capacity to increase their levy as they choose, because they've been underlevying so much. So they said, well, we're gonna keep it flat, and now, because they're not growing as quickly, they're getting less state aid, they're saying, well, we're gonna have to increase our levy, actually. So they have the ability to do that because they have underlevied, and they're not levying to their maximum, whereas pretty much every other district, other than Richmond for a few years, has been levying to the max because that is the revenue that they are permitted to get, and that's what they need to operate. So if you are functioning in that way, you tend to look very similar. You know, other than, like I said, if you have an operational referendum or something odd like that.
So that means Hudson must have been way higher when the revenue limits were set, and that was like, what,
93?
93?
So that's right, Lori. I think I mentioned that in the paragraph there. Revenue limits depend to a significant degree to where you started. And so if you were a district that was levying a lot and had a lot of revenue when revenue limits were imposed, that was your starting point, and you were continuing on from there, a per member increase year over year. Well, if you didn't need that, and add into that, Hudson has historically been growing, and so their state aid also has been increasing. That allows them to underlevy.
And for a lot of schools, including Somerset, we were under levying in 1992 or 93 or whenever that was set.
I think
And so
there's a great many districts that would fall into the kind of the middle ground, the median, and we would fall into that, I'd say. Some districts really suffer and have had to do much earlier, have had to pass operational referenda.
And we were fortunate because we kept growing for a while too.
That's right, yeah, that is a big factor. So a couple of the main takeaways, and you'll see this again and again, I want to make sure to kind of harp on is the things that affect us most, our revenue most, locally. What is the student population? What is our membership count for students? Then at the state level, what is the state deciding to do in their 2-year budgets to put resources into school districts or not do so? Those two things, you will see, it kind of all ties together. That's where we have our revenue determined. So state equalization aid falls within the revenue limit. So the revenue limit is the biggest factor. That determines a great majority of our revenue. This is what you can obtain in revenue from a combination of state equalization aid and your levy. Now, equalization aid itself, as making up part of the levy, is also based on, in large part, on the membership student count. And so again, Somerset is the thicker, bright red line. It's a similar curve to the revenue limit membership. It's not as smooth because the revenue limit membership is a 3-year average. This one is just a prior year count. You can see again, and I had removed the bigger districts. Hudson and New Richmond and River Falls. Down here with everybody included and the state average included, you can see again, this would be the membership, this would be the equalized value per member. And so I discussed this in the little paragraph here, but this is how our state aid is determined. How rich or poor does a school district look? So you take the equalized value of the whole district and you divide it by the state aid student membership count, you get equalized value per member. Within this, we, the bright red line, are very similar in trajectory to many of the others. But you can see if the state average is this dotted light blue line, we were very close to that average and then we were below it during the Great Recession. Now we're getting closer again. And the importance of that line is within the formula, all districts get a certain small amount, assuming they're not off the charts, equalized value per member. Then a medium calculation, it's a complicated formula, but there's this last bit where as you get closer to this line, the state average, if your equalized value per member exceeds that, then you start getting negative aid, wherein they take aid from your calculation. And so, again, this would be Hudson up here. They get their full calculated aid, and then because they appear to be so rich compared to other districts in the state, some of their aid is taken through negative tertiary aid and is provided to the districts that are poorer, according to this calculation, equalized value per member. So the things that can affect this is your student count going up or down? Is it flat? And then what is your equalized value doing? So after during the Great Recession, property values went down, our membership was flat or not significantly changing, but because the overall property value is going down, our property value per member was going down. So now property values are going up quite a bit, and our student count is also going down a little bit. So our property value per member is going up. We are appearing richer compared to other districts in the state on average. And so our aid over this swoop here has been decreasing comparatively. That being said, the overall pool of aid can still be increased by the state legislature, and we can still get more aid, but this is just proportionate. So what I want you to take away from this, again, is that there are limited things that we can do locally to affect our revenues. Anything that we can do where we can increase our membership count, our student count, is the thing that has a big impact on our revenue limit, on the revenue that we're able to accumulate. Some of the things that happen on a local level, like property values, we don't necessarily have control over, but they also can have an effect on what our state aid looks like. Open enrollment is another, has been lately another large historical revenue for us. This chart is illustrating this little check line here is at 1.0, wherein this is a ratio of open enroll in to out. And so we have been kind of steadily decreasing from having almost 2 to 1 students coming in to out to now being last year and this year, just about 1 to 1. And so this is something where this is outside of the revenue limit formula. The revenue limit formula, again, determining the great majority of the district revenue. This is outside of that, and so if there are things the district can do locally where we don't lose students to open enrollment, or if we can attract students in via open enrollment, that helps us. That's a net gain. The students that go out, we pay some of our state aid to whatever district they go to. The students that come in, we get paid that student, that state aid from whatever district they are resident from as a tuition to our district. So while the proportion in and out has been changing, the total revenue has been increasing because the amount per member is going up and the totals are going up. But while our revenue is going up, what we're paying out is also going up, and so it's less of a net gain for us than it has been historically.
Do we know, well, we must know where they go, the open enrolls that go out?
Yeah, I think there's been some discussion of that because we were wondering, are there virtual academies and such that
I
kids are
think we
going
get
to?
a chart of that once a year on one of our board meetings. I can't remember if it's the annual report or if it's a different one, but we can see how many went to each place. And something that I found interesting was that St. Croix Central, which had an enrollment nearly identical to ours, when ours started going down, theirs stayed steady. And when I looked at it more closely, their high school was going down like ours was, but their virtual, they opened up a virtual academy
Oh, that's right,
and
yeah.
they made up those numbers there.
A lot of students that are doing sports will do that as well to be able to be enrolled in a school and do the virtual side.
And I think if I remember right, St. Croix Central, while many of the districts in the region during this COVID year had memberships decrease, I think they went up a little bit overall, and I would assume it's because of that.
They had the most years of experience with that virtual education.
Yep. Any other question or comment? So here's a compared revenue per member and cost per member. These are hard to compare apples to apples. These have the definitions here below that are DPI definitions. They actually take all of our reported data on an annual basis, and they try to get to this TCEC, the total current educational cost. They try to get to where they're taking out the odd stuff that a district might be doing that another district is doing differently. It's not perfect. It's not ever apples to apples, but you can read those definitions, total district cost through the other two. This is sorted on educational cost per member, this right-hand-most column, and you can see the state average is at the bottom here. And then there is also revenue per member, which is all revenues. There's no special sorting according to revenues. And then also it's charted. That table there is charted down here. So it's all the same information. And this is something, personally, I don't know that there's always a strong takeaway from this. People ask about this sometimes. I think context is important. What is a district doing? What is their plan for how to spend their money or what they are trying to do with revenues? And you can see it's 1920, so I know, for instance, Osceola here will be up since then just because of their referendum and their expenditures through that. But again, some of these things can change relative to each other depending on what the student membership is doing, because we're always dividing by that. So any questions on this summary of mainly revenues? All right. So now we'll jump in. I did get a chance to update the presentation, the process presentation. And I added a little to it. I hope it's still, I don't want to get too bogged down in it. I did like the previous version. And this one has a little more detail. But I also wanted to at least update all the charts and everything so that we weren't looking at 2016-17 information. All right. So this is an overview, school district finance 101. I'm trying to get, so you can see what we talked about, why is it important. When you see things from the business office or in general, does it tie together? Does it help over time through the course of the year to kind of paint the picture of what's happening? So we talk about budget creation and management, some oversight, forecasting, review. These are things that will overlap throughout the year as part of board discussion. Though some things certainly have steps in the process, one being the business session. Later this month, we'll be talking about the budget for the upcoming year and approving that on a preliminary basis. So again, this is the codes. Can I help you?
I'm just hoping I find the.
I was looking down and didn't see where you went to get to that,
I'll
so.
hold on a second.
I got it,
Okay.
we're good.
So the codes, this is, it can seem a little overwhelming at first, these lines of code, especially on these monthly reports. But if you just pick out the different sections of code, you can always go back and say, well, what does this generally mean? What does this represent? And of course, it goes without saying, you can always ask us, whatever question you have, but if you're going through it on your own, this is how things are defined. So I tried to color code green for revenues, red for function codes for expenditure, and blue for object codes for expenditure. And so here, monthly reports, here's the board check listing. Again, I hope this is showing up clearly in front of you on your laptop. I put a little star next to the name of the report so you can reference that again when you see it. Board check listing has the monthly, all the monthly expenditures. You see, here's a code, a string of code here. Fund, location, object, function. Red is function, blue is object. Also, there's monthly receipts, revenues. There's this 3-digit code is the important one. That's the revenue source. We can see these are the summary reports you get every month with the current year budget, percentage, activity for the current year, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 prior years to show comparatively what those years look like. And again, object, you can see where they show up. You can see the functions, and then there's a combination, function and object, where it's the same information broken down a little more detail, and again, with comparison over the years. Revenue as well, that's usually the last page in the budget to actual packet on a monthly basis. So again, in use, the quarterly reports where we get a little more in depth, a lot of it is very similar year over year. There's one section where I like to pull out selected areas of expenditure. And again, that's generally by function. Function, the red boxes throughout, are where expenditures are made in the district. Object shows what that expenditure is for. So again, these will show up and these will recur. And sometimes it does look very similar. Year over year over year, there's a lot of similarity. This is also from the quarterly report. It's revenues. And you can see again the little 3-digit source code for specific revenues. There are not as many revenue codes. Now, at the budget hearing in September, we review and approve this detail format. This summary format is what is published in the paper. And so right here, this section is all the revenues for Fund 10, right here. While this is the detail of that. So all of these are various 200 source revenues that all combine into this one line, 200 summary. So the total here is this one line here. And then right away, we get into functions in the summary published format. All of this, again, is just for your familiarity, trying to say this is where you see and understand what we talk about when we talk about numbers. Another monthly report, the cash flow chart. There is no code on this. This is all funds. And it's simply an accounting of district cash flow. The timeline, this is included in the budget hearing every year. And a year like this last one, it's been a little wonky, a little off, but generally, this is very similar year over year as well. Some of the highlights for the timeline for budgeting throughout the year, some of the important events. So, major expenditures. These are personnel, by far our biggest expenditure. Contracted services, and then the physical plant, the buildings and so forth, and the grounds. Now, for most districts, the personnel costs are a bit higher than for us, but that's because we contract out where other districts might not, for custodial, for transportation, for food service. All that is, for us, is a contracted service, it's a purchased service. Whereas in other districts, many districts around here at least, those are also employees, and so that's employee personnel cost. The things that I like to talk about, and the things where the board has the most input generally, is in regard to fixed versus discretionary, specifically discretionary. The intent of the department budgets, when they come before you to talk about their current situation, the current year, and their plan for the upcoming year, and this is usually January, February, March, the intent is that they give you a picture of what their discretionary budgets are. This is where we make our choices and how we spend the funds that we are able to decide upon. Some things are fixed costs, and we don't have a choice. And I was talking to Trish actually about this presentation, trying to get a little insight into how to best present and try to teach. And she said as she was going through, for some of her licensure, she was going through some budgetary classes, and this was in Minnesota, but she heard something that stuck with her, and I thought it was a really good analogy, and that is, if you think of the budget as a chocolate chip cookie, you've got this whole big budget, and you pick out one chocolate chip out of the cookie, maybe that's your supply budget, right? Now, it's not a perfect analogy. I would say it's something even smaller than a chocolate chip, but think of it that way. The whole big cookie, that's baked in. There's not a lot you can do unless you're making big decisions, like we need to reduce staffing, or we need to hire more for a virtual school. Those are big decisions. Those things are baked in year over year. The little things that we can affect on a year-to-year basis are generally little. There's not a lot of leeway. And so, again, if you think, okay, cookie, chocolate chip, that's what we're talking about in a lot of situations. Did you like that as much as I did?
Makes me hungry.
Personnel.
On the revenue side, we talk about these things, and a lot of times it's kind of me informing you or us or Mark if he has new information. What have we heard regarding the state budget? What is the state legislature doing? A lot of this, the revenue limit again being the biggest factor for our revenues, whether or not we get a per member increase in the amount that we can increase our revenue limit is a state decision. So we can try to influence that through communication with our legislators, but we don't directly control that. Some of the other revenues, categorical aids outside of the revenue limit, federal grants, like the titles, or flow through for special ed, also outside of the revenue limit. And then factors that affect revenues. I include this not so that you try to rack your brain and figure out exactly how all this works. I know it appears very confusing just to glance at. But I want to illustrate, this is our revenue limit sheet calculation. This is the calculation that determines on an annual basis the total amount that we'll be getting through equalization aid, general state aid, and levy. And so the most important factor, again, for us locally, is this here. It's our current 3-year average for student FTE. And it includes our actual September count, and then 40% of our summer school count. And then it's averaged over 3 years, with the current year being the latest year. So that is our revenue limit membership. The formula is such that we take our prior revenue and divide it by those members, that member count. We get a revenue per student FTE. Now, this is where the important state factor comes in. Have they, at a state level, given us an increase per member, per student FTE for this year's calculation? Now, for this last state budget, they did. And so we would add, in this case, for this year, this is the current year's revenue limit, $179 per member,
Per year or over 3 years?
just for this year.
Okay.
And then we'll use this total then as a starting point for next year's base calculation.
Okay.
So I wanted to illustrate, in prior years when I've shown this, after Act 10, for a number of years, it was 0. There was no increase. And so the revenue per FTE was not increasing. So it's increasing. This is where we then multiply by our current number. And again, a few more tweaks going on. If you're declining enrollment, you get some exceptions. Various other exceptions here, but the main factor is what is the multiplication, and then we end up with our revenue limit with all exemptions for the year, which again includes our general state aid and our levy. This is our major source of revenue. So I wanted to, again, illustrate the local component and the state component. Now, I don't want to get bogged down too much, and so I apologize if this is a little confusing. Here is our 3-year average revenue limit membership. So each year is a 3-year average for the 2 years prior in that year. You can see it's smooth, just like we saw on the website. It's not as choppy year over year, up and down. Now here, the red line is the total revenue limit. So again, keep in mind that these charts are truncated. The amounts on the bottom are not 0. So prior to Act 10, revenue limit overall going up. Act 10 going down. The blue is what the state was doing to support education. This is the per member increase year over year. Act 10, 5.5% decrease. So you can see our overall revenue limit went down. Now, it's not just the revenue limit per member increase or the decrease that matters, it's also what is our student count doing, because you multiply that by the student count. So both those things come into play. Here's our student count. Here's the state-provided support, the blue. So again, total revenue limit, up, down, kind of flat. Now there's a big jump here. And if you remember that, we discussed that a little earlier, that's our past operational referendum. In combination with a little bit factor from these blue per member increases. So it's still going up a bit, but the biggest jump is from the referendum. And then I wanted to point out 2 different non-revenue limit revenues that have become, for us, decent size. After this, it's the next one, the next sizable revenue would be federal grants, and they don't come close to these amounts. So each one, the red line illustrates the total amount of the revenue we're talking about. On the left is the per pupil aid, which took place after Act 10. It was intended to make up for some of the state not providing a per member increase on the revenue limit itself. It's tied directly to the same 3-year membership count as the revenue limit. So this is the per year increase, the per year state support, and then this is the total per year. You can see we're over $1 million at this point. That's a significant revenue for us. The same with open enrollment tuitions. Again, the red line is the total open enrollment revenue, the tuitions we get paid in by other districts because students from those districts attend Somerset. And the blue is the increase in that amount of tuition per student. Now I should note that 17-18, I didn't differentiate, but there was an amount, there was an increased amount for special ed students that is a greater amount per pupil than for general ed students. But that's all combined in this total here, in the red total. So again, if you go across, we're right around $1 million again. This is a significant revenue for us. Outside of the revenue limit. These are the two main ones. So as far as review.
Dave, can I ask you a question on slide 15 where you had the major revenues, revenue limit?
Yes.
Do you have a, actually slide 15, it's 15 on my computer. Anyway, it's your actual balance sheets. Do you have, is there a number, like, is there, yeah, thank you, yeah. I'm looking at the 3-year on the left, 2017, 18, 19. How much revenue is brought in by a summer school student? Do you have an approximate?
Well, so the number, you can see the actual FTE calculations are the top yellow line. And here it's the top white, and yellow line, or cells, I should say. And so you can see our program was growing, 83, 110, 99, 98, and then this year 44, I want to say. That's based on, it's attendance and the number of minutes overall for all students attending summer school.
Okay.
And so it's, I think it's 48,600 minutes equal 1 FTE. And so the bigger program you have, the larger that number is. And of course, it depends how you staff that now to balance that with the cost of the program. But then you take that and you multiply by 40%. That's the amount of that FTE that's included in this revenue limit membership FTE.
Okay.
So I have looked at that in the past. I can't tell you a specific dollar amount off the top of my head, but I have looked some years on a revenue limit basis only, not talking about state aid, because to me, state aid is part of revenue limit. It's within that.
Yep.
It's offsetting levy, but just as far as growing revenue, some years it's net positive, and some years it's, net neutral or a little negative. It hasn't been a huge growing factor for our revenue limit necessarily over time, but it's not a huge drain either, and it's a big cultural, has a big impact for our community historically.
If a kid from Somerset School District goes to another district for summer school, does that district have to pay us?
No.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, did I answer?
That's it. Yep, that was it. Thank you.
So I wanted to, okay, so I know we may have some questions. I'll touch on this briefly. Process, what are we reviewing internally and externally? Internally, you've seen now, and I showed you earlier in this presentation, there's a lot of monthly reporting that you look at that is available to you that shows revenues and expenditures. There's a lot of detail of what the expenditures are, broken down in the check listing. on a monthly basis. On a quarterly basis, we look at trend in general compared to prior years in a bigger picture sort of way, but we also take a look at the highlighted areas of expenditure. Things that either we've talked about in the past, we've had concerns about in the past, board members have asked about and have interest in. I like to include those in there. Some of them are department level, whether it's IT or curriculum. Some it's transportation, sub-costs, legal fees, areas and programs of note. So I try to highlight anything that's interesting and speak to that on a quarterly basis. We have the annual reports for program, department, and building, where principals or Trish or Trent or Abby come in and talk to you about their budgets. George, what should you expect for the coming year? How has this year been going? If there's any new initiatives that they want to be built into the budget, that's where they talk to you about it, is our preference. Sometimes things still come up and people may come before the board and say, we would like to do this program or have this expenditure, but usually the intent is that it happens during these reports from the people who oversee those budgets. And a good example would be a couple years ago now when Trish presented the plan to move to one-to-one for students. That was an increase in budget allocation that was needed to fund that. That's where it was first mentioned. Projects and as needed, as things come up, we will talk. And then external, the annual financial audit. It's the work that's been done during the year. It's an annual audit by an independent auditing firm. They come in, they look at our procedures, they focus on different things that DPI tells them to focus on a given year, but they also look at the whole. They say, do you have any issues with numbers themselves? Do you have any issues with the procedures that you followed or the controls that you have in place? This is an annual report. And so I'll just jump quick to what are the takeaways. This is what the document looks like. I give you a paper copy when we get them usually in December. It's also on the website under the financial reports. It communicates the results to management, which is administration and the school board. It has all of the numbers, the statements, the descriptions, and then the most important part, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I think you should be concerned, the schedule of findings and question costs. That's usually at the very back, and we always get two. Every district our size gets two. One is that we don't create our own financial statements. We hire an auditor to do that. And one is that we don't have enough staff to have perfect controls throughout the business office. You would need to hire enough people to separate all tasks to a degree that there's no ability to have any mistakes or any issues. And districts our size aren't big enough to hire that many staff for that purpose. You have to get to be a bigger district before you don't get that finding. So, all that being said, I want to reference all the documents from the screenshots you see, obviously the website. I guess I didn't leave much time for questions, but if you have any questions.
I know where you're at. We'll be getting another quarterly report at the regular session in June or July? June?
Well, the next one will be probably August.
August, because the end of the fiscal year is June 30th. So it's just that it's not ready until August?
Yeah, so we have to, essentially, the end of the fiscal year, there's a lot of closing out of books, there's a lot of receivable revenues, there's some payables that have yet to be paid, specifically teacher payrolls have not actually been paid, though they're on the books. There's a lot of year-end closing things that have to happen so that we can close up all the books in Skyward, everything we're doing here, get that to the auditors, report that. I try to have that process wrapped up before I run the final reports. And so you usually notice the June meeting, the June information, the business session for July, that data is never complete. It's just not ready yet. And so once it's complete, by the end of July usually, then I can run the reports and populate the quarterly report. Because we are, like I said, preparing to close everything down, preparing for all of our auditing. Yeah, here's the most recent one was for Q3. That was through March of this year. And keep in mind that this was before we approved the amended budget. So now, I've reported that to DPI, I'm working to get that into Skyward. Then that will be the budget upon which the Q4 report is based. So there's gonna be a little difference between the first two and the last, but we're all aware of why that is.
Okay, thank you. And if people have questions, make sure you contact Dave at a later date.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Okay, thank you.